our web talk series, America Decides 2020, a cooperation between the Friedrich-Naumann Foundation for Freedom and the University of Bonn. My name is Pia Herzan. I'm the program manager of the Friedrich-Naumann Foundation here in Hamburg. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's episode of congressional, gubernatorial, as well as elections of individual states within the US. Tonight, I'm joined by Dr. Philipp Adorf, who will represent the University of Bonn, and he will serve as an expert as well as your moderator later on in the talk. Dr. Adorf is a research assistant at the Institute for Political Science and Sociology. His research interests include the Republican Party and its history since 1960, race relations in the US, as well as the success of right-wing populists within the working class. He recently published a book which combines all three of those interests. It's in German, it's called the Republikanische Partei in den USA, the Republican Party in the US. So feel free to look into it when you follow our theories. It's really interesting. And throughout our web talk, as you know, we welcome each week another new expert. An expert who will give us insights in one particular topic regarding the US elections. And tonight, we are really delighted to welcome Mike Cowburn from the Freie University in Berlin. He studied in the University of Exeter, as well as at the University in Berlin at the John F. Kennedy Institute for North American Studies, where he first finished his master's before he just started his PhD at the Graduate School of North American Studies. And he's an expert, of course, of tonight's subject, which is concurrent to his dissertation topic. The topic goes as follows. He will explain more in detail later, but I just give you as much. It looks at the development of ideological discourses in congressional primary elections and how these changing strategies mobilize potential supporters in both primary and general elections by fostering connection between voters and parties as well. This research focus further also go to polarization, political parties, primary elections, and intra-party competition. He will tell us more in a few minutes, so I'll leave you with that. But before I give you over or hand you over to both experts, I just want to briefly mention tonight's procedures. We will hear in total 3 shorter keynotes, which will focus on congressional elections in general, as well as the specifics of 2020, and also the composition they have on the US Congress and the state elections. We would like to invite everyone who joins us via Zoom to also participate within our discussions as usual. For that, you can just look, if you join us via Zoom, on the lower part of your screen, and you see an F&A button, which you can just click on, and a screen window will pop up in which you can anonymously, as well as also with mentioning your name, ask your question. And this you can do either in German if you like, or in English, and Dr. Adorf will try to include as many of your questions as he can within the discussion he will have with Mike Cowburn. So I wish you all a wonderful evening, an informative evening, and with no further ado, I'll hand you over to Philipp Adorf. Enjoy.
Well, thank you very much, and a warm welcome to all of our viewers tonight as well from my end, and of course a very warm welcome to our guests, Mike Cowburn from Berlin, who will, as has already been mentioned, talk a bit more about the primary process, which really helps illustrate the sort of internal composition of the different parties. I mean, what makes voters tick? What kind of issues do they keep in mind when they go to the polls in primaries? And so in a sense, what are primary voters looking for when they cast their ballot for a certain congressional candidate? The presidential race, of course, understandably receives the sort of lion's share of attention internationally and also in the United States. But I think in a lot of ways, congressional races are almost more interesting from a scholarly perspective, and perhaps also from the perspective of the impact this has on domestic politics. And if you just look at the data, of course, every 4 years we have one presidential election, but every 2 years, all 435 seats to the US House of Representatives, the lower chamber of Congress, are up for re-election, as are a third of all Senate seats. So while, as I mentioned, every 4 years you have one presidential election, you have about 900 congressional races. So if you want to figure out what makes voters tick, what kind of recent developments do we see ideologically within the parties. I think it sometimes makes sense to focus on those congressional races. I mean, at the presidential level, you have a lot of different considerations that play a role here. I mean, if you, for example, look at Joe Biden voters might have wondered, well, is he going to do well among working class voters? Is he going to do well in certain parts of the country? But when it comes to individual districts, I think voters have a far narrower band of considerations. And if Joe Biden wants to enact a Democratic agenda, of course, he will need a Democratic majority in the Senate as well. Things are looking pretty good for the Democrats in the House, but as has been illustrated by the recent vacancy of the Supreme Court, a Senate majority is always something that is quite nice to have, and undoubtedly the Democrats will be pushing for that majority quite hard this time around. Before we delve more deeply into this year's congressional primaries, I wanted to quickly provide you with a short overview of the state of the race in both chambers, so that we're essentially all on the same page. As I mentioned, things are looking pretty good for the Democrats in the lower chamber of Congress, in the House of Representatives. Essentially, we're already quite certain that the Democrats are going to retain their majority. One key reason for that is that a relatively small share of seats these days is competitive. The data that you're looking at right here is from the Cook Political Report, which classifies different congressional districts on the basis of their partisan lean. In other words, how much more Republican or Democratic they are compared to the country at large. And you see a tremendous decrease in the number of swing districts. In other words, districts where that are between 5 points more Republican to 5 points more Democratic. And that, of course, has to do with polarization, for example. Both parties are ideologically further apart, something that we will address later on as well. And partisan preferences have become far more entrenched. So in other words, if you want to obtain a majority, you essentially need a wave election. It's very difficult to just chip away at a majority bit by bit, and then as the opposition party get that majority. And that's something that we've seen in recent years. I mean, in 2018, you had a Democratic wave in the House of Representatives. Before that, the last time that a majority changed hands was in 2010, when you had the Tea Party wave of the Republican Party. Before that, Democrats were able to obtain a majority in 2006. After Hurricane Katrina and during an unpopular Iraq war. So as we know already, there isn't going to be a red wave this year. So there essentially is a 95 to 99% chance of the Democrats retaining their majority. And as you can see, the most recent Cook political ratings show that just 26 seats are regarded as toss-ups. You have 190 districts that are likely Democratic. This means that they are essentially non-competitive, and 150 Republican seats that are likely Republican. And then you have a few more lean Democratic and lean Republican seats. But essentially you have, as is illustrated here, a very small, a very narrow playing field in congressional elections. So it's very difficult, as I mentioned, to obtain that majority. This also means, and we'll get back to that in a second, that the primaries in a lot of districts have actually taken on the role of the general election. So this might explain some of the differing attitudes that primary voters have towards their own candidates. They know that whoever makes it out of the primary in a certain district, in a deeply red or deeply blue district, will in all likelihood win the general election. So that's one of the key changes here as well. Moving on to this year's election, one interesting facet is that a comparatively high number of incumbents have already been defeated in the primaries. I say comparatively high because if you look at the number 8, 5 of them Republicans, 3 Democrats, that's not a particularly huge number, but still it is the highest number of office holders in the House of Representatives that didn't make it out of the primaries in an election cycle that did not follow a redistricting process since 1974. Now, why do I specifically mention redistricting? A bit of a heads up, we're going to talk, or I will talk about this a bit later on as well, about the process of redistricting. But every 10 years you have a census, which is still ongoing right now in the United States. It was supposed to end tomorrow, but it's been extended, or the data collection period has been extended for another month. And on the basis of that census, the 435 seats to the US House are reallocated. So some states are, for example, losing seats, some states are gaining seats. And this sometimes means that if districts have been redrawn, two incumbents could be in the same district, which means one of them is obviously going to have to lose. And the elections that end in 2012, 2002, 1992, these are the elections in which that are contested for the first time with these new district lines. So this is where you always see a rather high number of incumbents that sort of bite the dust and that don't make it to the general election. And again, this time around, a relatively or comparatively high number of both Republicans and Democrats that were sort of kicked out of the House relatively early on. But as I mentioned, we'll get back to redistricting later on because that's quite an interesting topic from a state level perspective and the impact that this has on federal politics. So this is the House. Moving on to the chamber that the Democrats obviously have their eyes on, the Senate. Just a quick overview. Of course, last time around in the 2018 midterms, we had the fascinating result that you had a Democratic wave, a veritable Democratic tsunami at the House level, but for some reason Republicans were able to actually gain seats in the Senate, which is coming in quite handy right now because they need all hands on deck for the confirmation of Amy Coney Barrett. So those two additional seats could potentially make the difference this time around. The reason why Republicans won 2 seats or a net gain of 2 seats 2 years ago was that you had far more Democratic seats up for re-election than Republicans. So you had a number of Democratic senators in deeply red territories like North Dakota and Missouri that just didn't make it this time around. But in 2020, the roles are somewhat reversed. As you can see, Republicans have to defend about twice as many Senate seats as Democrats, which is good news for the Democrats because it provides them with more pickup opportunities. The baseline is right now 47 to 53. However, if you look at the map, you will see that Alabama is one state that Democrats may actually lose. This is where Doug Jones is running for re-election. Perhaps you might remember in 2017 in a special election, he beat Roy Moore in Alabama. A deeply red state. Roy Moore, over the final weeks of the contest, was accused of sexual assault and misconduct by a number of women who were underage at the time. Despite this, Doug Jones only beat Roy Moore by, I think, 1.5 percentage points, which sort of illustrates just how red Alabama is. And since Doug Jones, in this context, in 2017, he ran for the seat that was occupied by Jeff Sessions. And he filled the seat until the next sort of general election. And since Doug Jones is this time around not running against somebody who was accused of sexual assault, but against a relatively normal Republican, he's probably going to lose, which means Democrats have to pick up 4 other seats. And if you look at the map, you will see that Larry Sabato's crystal ball has 3 Republican Senate seats already classified as likely Democratic gains: Colorado, Arizona, and Maine. So they need to pick up 1 more seat, or potentially 2. I mean, the situation is, you may know this, if there's a 50-50 split in the Senate, the vice president will cast the tie-breaking vote. But I would assume that if Democrats do win 4 seats and if they get to 50, that would be an environment in which Joe Biden would also win the presidency and Kamala Harris would then cast the tie-breaking votes. But as you can see, there are probably about 8 serious pickup opportunities. An interesting example might be Lindsey Graham, whose seat has just been moved into the lean Republican territory. And the most recent polls actually put him in a head-to-head race with his Democratic challenger. Lindsey Graham used to be quite a notable critic of Donald Trump, but he has since become one of his biggest supporters. And it'll be interesting to see if his behavior during the confirmation process is going to help or hurt him in South Carolina, because Lindsey Graham 4 years ago said, now is not the time to appoint a Supreme Court justice. We have to wait until the election. And he essentially, he told everybody, you can quote me on that. If this ever happens, if the roles are reversed, you can say Lindsey Graham said that you should not confirm a Supreme Court justice in an election year. He's since come out and said, well, come on, Democrats, you would do the same if you were in my situation. So it'll be interesting to see what's going to happen there. Finally, before we move on to today's guest, just one quick overview of the likelihood of Democrats winning the Senate. Most of the forecasts essentially give the Democratic Party a 2 in 3 chance of obtaining a majority in the Senate, which is of course slightly lower than what you have in the presidential race, where most forecasters say there's an 80 to 90% chance of Biden winning. Who knows what kind of impact the debate may or may not have on it tonight. But you see that things are looking pretty good for the Democrats as well when it comes to obtaining a Senate majority. So without further ado, question that now poses itself. So how did we get to this kind of environment? What kind of trends perhaps revealed themselves in the 2020 primaries? To what extent do these trends perhaps represent a continuation of previous intra-party contests? What makes the activist base of both parties tick? And these are questions to which our guest Mike Cowburn will now provide answers and other insights.
So yes, thank you very much. So the first thing I need to do obviously is thank both Dr. Adorf and Frau Herzen, and you should now be able to see my screen. Perfect. Yep. So yeah, hi, I'm Mike Cowburn, and I'm a PhD candidate at the Graduate School of North American Studies. My plan for the next 10-12 minutes is to talk about the congressional primary elections. So these are the elections that have been taking place across the last 6 months. So basically since the start of March, and then I think then we'll move on to the next topic. So there have been several interesting things happening in congressional primaries over the past few electoral cycles, and particularly over the past decade. So we can see here, when we look at the number of primary contests that are contested. So what we mean here is 2 or more people on the ballot. There's been a big increase, first in the Republican Party in 2010. So we can see that spike is reflective of the entrance of the Tea Party, who their candidates then enter these primaries in 2010. And we see then that there's a big increase in the numbers of Democratic contests in 2018. And this then leads to an influx of new progressive members of Congress. So these members overwhelmingly tend to be women, often women of color, and this kind of generational change that takes place 2 years ago. So while it's important to note that these changes happened in wave elections that were very good for the respective parties, it's also interesting to note that since, in the Republican Party, certainly since the 2010 cycle, we've seen consistently high numbers of contested primaries. So even though this wave election happens, the numbers don't revert back to the kind of 2006, 2008 levels. And again, even in the kind of small amount of data we've got from this year, we can see again high numbers of contested Democratic primaries as well. Alongside that, we've seen similar patterns in the total number of candidates who are running for Congress. So importantly, what we see here is that there's increased numbers of candidates across all different types of primaries. So when you're looking at primary elections, the most important variable is the presence of an incumbent. So of course, you have incumbent primaries in the party from whom the incumbent sits. You also have then challenger primaries for the right to face the incumbent in the general election. And then of course you have open primaries where the incumbent retires. And what we've seen over the last 10 years is increases in the number of candidates across all these different types of primaries. And they have very different kind of implications for the parties. What's also very notable is how voters have reacted to this. So the increased competition has resulted in much greater levels of voter participation. So we can see in 2010 a big jump in the numbers of Republican voters casting ballots for Republicans in primaries, and then since then relatively flat with a few more voters in presidential years. whereas in the Democratic side, again, the numbers hold sort of relatively flat until 2014. And then since 2014, we've seen big increases in the number of voters participating and voting for Democratic candidates, such that even though much of this primary season took place during a pandemic, this was actually the highest number of sort of record numbers of votes for Democratic candidates and increased levels of Republican participation. So one of the questions my research looks at is, why has this been happening? And one of the things I've done in my research is I've been coding reasons for primary contests taking place across these last 8 election cycles. So starting with the Republicans, this graph shows the changes in the reasons for Republican House primaries. I'm sorry, I think the key might be slightly small there, but the most interesting line here is this ideology category, which is this dashed orange line. And so what we see in 2010 a really large increase in the number of contests taking place due to ideological differences between the candidates. And once that happens, this ideology category then becomes the main reason, remains the main reason why congressional primaries are taking place. At the same time, there are comparatively fewer primaries based on candidate competence or experience, what are termed in political science as valence factors. Though it is noteworthy that there was a return to greater numbers of competence primaries in the Republican Party this cycle. It's also noteworthy to point out the increase in national issues, which is this third line here, which reflects a wider culture of nationalization of not just primary politics, but also congressional elections more generally. When we look at then the same trends in the Democratic Party, we can see that this divergence between the ideology and the competence numbers takes place much later, such that it's 2018 that we really see the big spike, but there's no real divergence even in 2014. And then a similar pattern takes place on this national issue category, but again, taking place much later. So yeah, the numbers of competence primaries in this time kind of remain flat, but what we see is this rise in ideological difference within the parties demonstrated via the primaries. Now, one of the notable trends that happens along at the same time as this is the decreasing number of non-incumbents who have no previous experience in elected office. So this is just the percentages of non-incumbent candidates who win their primaries and then go forward to the general election. And we see here basically a very large decline after 2008, generally on the Republican side, and then that decline taking place slightly later, again on the Democratic side. So again, in the political science terminology, this is what's termed as candidate quality. But we see there a big drop from 2008 down to 2020 from, I think that's about almost 40% of Republican candidates having held prior office to roughly 20 in 2020. And I think it's about 17% of candidates having held prior office on the Democratic side. What do these divisions look like? So most notably, this cycle, we've seen the clear continuation of a narrative set in 2018 of this progressive versus establishment nature within the Democratic Party. So I've just picked up on a couple of the notable races here, but there were many more that took place between progressives and establishment. So one successful example of a challenge to an incumbent was in Illinois' 3rd district, where progressive Marie Newman challenged and defeated the moderate incumbent Dan Lipinski. She actually also challenged Lipinski 2 years ago and came very close, but narrowly lost out and kind of built her resources and from there and ran again and managed to defeat him. And there was also a very high profile and fiercely fought battle for the Massachusetts Senate seat. So progressive incumbent Ed Markey, who was the co-sponsor of the Green New Deal, managed to defeat the comparative establishment Joe Kennedy, so member of the Kennedy family, actually the first Kennedy to lose an election in Massachusetts. So he was actually a member of the House of Representatives. He gave up his seat in the House of Representatives to challenge in this primary and was ultimately unsuccessful in doing so. So on the Republican side, we have a couple of interesting trends. So since Trump's election in 2016, we've seen a strong trend of candidates either very closely aligning themselves with President Trump or declining to mention him whatsoever and running on kind of traditional and business conservative platforms. And that continued again this year. But there was another narrative as well that took place, and that was the emergence of QAnon candidates. And I've put on this slide versus the party, but it's a slightly more complicated relationship than that. So this candidate here is in Georgia's 13th district. Her name is Marjorie Taylor Clark. And it's worth noting that Georgia's 13th district is a safe Republican district. So as the winner of the primary, she will almost certainly be the new representative. So Taylor Clark is an outspoken supporter of the QAnon conspiracy theory. And the local Republican Party in Georgia tried to coordinate to prevent her from winning the primary. But unfortunately for them, several notable national figures, so including the founding member of the House Freedom Caucus, which was previously the Tea Party caucus, so Jim Jordan, came out and endorsed her during the primary. Trump did not engage during the primary, but on her victory was more than happy to send a tweet congratulating her on her victory. And so I use this example to show the difficulty that Republicans are having at the moment in maintaining control of their nomination process. So as they did for the presidency in 2016, what we've historically seen is that Democrats have been considered the more disorganized or disunited party. But where a lot of the successful progressives have done well tended to be in safe Democratic seats. What we've seen this cycle and last cycle for the Republicans is that in competitive seats that they've actually been unable to put forward what would be generally considered the strongest candidate. So a quick note on Trump, because of course we can't go through a presentation without mentioning him. So almost everyone that Trump endorsed won. But it's important to note a couple of caveats here. So if we look at these numbers, we can see that of the 111 candidates that Trump endorsed, 87 of them were incumbents. Of those 87, 86 did go ahead and win. He then did also endorse 24 non-incumbents, but 23 of those and 23 of those won. So a very, very high success rate, so 98% success rate for Trump. But it's important to note that what he's quite often doing here is kind of looking at seeing which way the wind blows and then going with it, rather than it being the case that he's the kind of leader on that. So I wanted to end by just touching on a couple of debates that exist within academia concerning congressional primaries at the moment. So the first of these is the influence that they may have in polarizing Congress. So as I'm sure many of you will know, since the 1980s, parties in Congress have become increasingly divided, and congressional primaries are often blamed, with the argument that candidates have to focus on appealing to their base at the expense of working across the aisle in order to prevent being challenged within the party. So what I've put forward here is a theoretical model. So this is a spatial model that basically thinks that the median voters in these primaries are more extreme than the candidates, and therefore the candidates must tack to the right in the Republican Party and the left in the Democratic Party. The empirical evidence of this is much more complicated than that, and evidence that primary electorates are more extreme than likely party voters in the general election is mixed, and empirical studies showing very little or no polarizing effect from primary elections. What's generally found is that the elites themselves are usually much more ideologically extreme than either the general or the primary voters. So whilst this theory may seem intuitive, the empirical data doesn't quite align. And then the final theory I wanted to touch on, which kind of stems from the polarization question, is this debate around the role of the formal party organization within nomination processes. So in 2008, there was this, what is now a very famous book called The Party Decides, which argued that in presidential nominations, elites, the kind of people who had previously made these decisions in smoke-filled rooms, continued to exert control over and influence over the process and the outcome. And this work in recent years has been applied to congressional races, again, with evidence that the party continues to play a very important role in things like clearing the field for their preferred candidates. Thank you very much. So I'll hand back to Philip. You're on mute.
Okay, so we're back now that the screen has been removed. Yeah, thank you very much for those insights, which I think really, as I mentioned, provided us with a good idea of what the voters of both parties want. I mean, personally, I think it's really fascinating to see how the Democrats have become more sort of ideologically driven in the last two election cycles. Once again, just a reminder to our audience, feel free to ask questions. You can ask them in any language, provided it's English or German. So, just go ahead and ask not whatever you want, but I think anything related to the congressional races, and perhaps we can also branch out and look at, well, what about the Supreme Court and the Senate and so forth. I mean, there are these discussions, are the Democrats, if they get a majority in the Senate, are they going to do away with the filibuster, for example? President Obama himself called for that. So again, be engaged, ask those questions. Perhaps I'm going to use this opportunity as the moderator to present the first question. What I personally find interesting looking at your data is that perhaps the increasing relevance of ideology has somewhat coincided with the decreasing competitiveness of the different districts. So in other words, as I mentioned at the very beginning, the primaries have taken on the role of the general election. Could this be an explanation as to why perhaps voters say, I can focus more on ideology? I don't have to keep in mind the fact that this candidate, once they make it out of the primary, they have to face another candidate. So, at the presidential level, you're always talking about how somebody like Biden has to win over certain moderate voters. Those considerations apparently are no longer that relevant in congressional races. So what kind of explanation do you perhaps have for this?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it aligns back to your previous slide. I think PVI is a really good measure for this. What we need to think about is the districts and where these factional primaries are taking place. So in some places, what you're seeing is exactly what you're arguing. So in safe districts for the party, there's an understanding that the seat is secure at the general election, it's not going to be lost. And so then the primary can become this site of democratic accountability and where different ideological preferences can be debated. There are other places, though, that there is a question about electability that's kind of become ingrained in the factional debate. So particularly on the Democratic side, so these kind of progressive factions are actually making the case that moderation or establishmentness is actually an electoral hindrance. So this kind of direct challenge to Downes's median voter theorem. And so if we look at somewhere like, say, the Kentucky Senate primary, where Charles Booker, who finished second to Amy McGrath, McGrath is the comparative moderate in that race and is now in the general election. But Booker's whole argument is what we need is progressive policies in order to be electorally viable. So we see really there's a big difference in the parties here, and that progressives have been much more coordinated and been much more successful in kind of safe democratic districts. And part of that is due to geographic reasons. There are just more very safe democratic districts, not through any nefarious means, just because democratic voters tend to be more urban. So it's difficult to say that the progressive wing has really done damage to the party. But I think you could, with the Tea Party, and now I would suggest some of the Trumpian Republicans, because of their kind of widespread nature, and there are actually quite a lot of empirical examples where you can see the party basically ends up with and maybe this isn't the right term, but on paper, weaker candidate that then has the potential to hinder their chances and potentially lose the party seats this November.
Okay, so let me just have a look. Perhaps a second question would be, I mean, and this is almost more of a political science question. At least traditionally, Democrats are sort of described as a coalition of group interests, whereas Republicans are more focused on or being more driven by ideology. Perhaps, I mean, not just looking at your data, I mean, do you think that the Democratic Party is heading down a similar path to where the Republicans have been? I mean, every few years you hear talk about a Democratic Tea Party that is about to emerge, and I think that was even the case almost 10 years ago after the initial Tea Party emerged. So is there evidence that the Democrats are still more focused on just governing, and that they recognize, as you mentioned, that sometimes electability is a good thing? I mean, you mentioned some argue you have to be progressive to be electable. Others say, no, you have to be more in the center. So what would be your take on that?
So this is great work that's been done by Matt Grossman and David Hopkins. And I definitely don't see my work as kind of contradictory to that. So I guess there's two main things to note here. The first would be that, yes, Republican candidates speak in more ideological terms. So they explicitly position themselves as more conservative than their opponents. And Democrats just don't do that with the term liberal, in part because it would be poor electoral strategy. But yeah, so the way that they speak about ideology does remain different. But the second thing to note is that these groups definitely do exist that remain in the Democratic Party. But what I'm seeing is an increasing alignment into these ideological factions. So let's go. I mean, the Marie Newman example that I gave in Illinois' 3rd. So she's running against Dan Lipinski in part because he isn't pro-choice. So he was one of the few remaining pro-life Democratic representatives in the House. And she's getting a lot of her resources through pro-life groups. And maybe 10 years ago, she would have run as a single issue candidate. But what she's doing now is she's also feeding into a broader set of policy positions, in part because the pro-choice groups now have much clearer connections to other policy areas. So they now have clearer connections to, say, the gun control groups. And these candidates then are increasingly aligned so then they're campaigning on kind of multiple policy fields in a way that they might not have been doing in the past. So yeah, I absolutely still see that group identity, and I think and I haven't really talked here about demographics. I haven't talked about the diversity which exists in the Democratic Party, which simply doesn't exist in the Republican Party, and that's definitely another part of it. But what I definitely see is as a kind of a wider grouping of these subgroups into what I've termed here faction.
Yeah, speaking of the factions, I mean, some of our viewers maybe watched some of our previous web talks as well. And a couple of weeks ago, we talked about just campaign spending and the general deregulation of campaign spending that we've seen, the Citizens United ruling by the Supreme Court and so forth. So in general, we've seen almost a bit of a free-for-all when it comes to certain groups spending money. Do you think that just the deregulation has made it easier or more promising for different factions, different groups to enter these races? I mean, you have the Club for Growth on the Republican side, you have the Justice Democrats on the Democratic side. Has the Supreme Court to a certain extent sort of nourished or fed into increasing factionalism or the increasing strength of these different factions?
So I guess this is one of those that it's complicated, is the answer. So yeah, in 2010, we get these two big court decisions. So first Citizens United in the Supreme Court, and then we get the speechnow.org decision in the DC court later that year. So research has shown that the effect of these has increased both the number and the diversity of what are termed independent expenditures, or IEs, taking place by large corporations. So there's some great work on this showing that after 2012, candidates who have the support of interest groups start performing much better in primaries against candidates who have the support of the formal party structure. And this is partly because the formal parties are more limited in the support they can receive versus these interest groups. But as with everything, there's slightly more to this. So the biggest change we've seen since Citizens United has been the rise of these single candidate political action committees. So these PACs turn up for one election cycle, support one candidate, and then disappear again, and never heard of again. And these are overwhelmingly being used to support incumbents. So it's not as simple as we might have expected. So we've seen a response or a fight back from the establishment in terms of coordinating endorsements, and also in reassigning funds between districts to making sure that any funds that are available are used as best for the party. And so we've really seen a big increase in IEs which support incumbents. And then the final point I would make on this is it's difficult to know. Because there's been lots of other changes going on simultaneously. So it's difficult to separate out, for example, the effects of these legal changes from ongoing technological changes. So the technological changes have meant that groups having differing abilities to raise funds online, and in fact, the increased participation and even the increased giving might have reduced the importance of these kind of highly polarized activist groups, the kind of groups you just mentioned there. And so they've maybe they're getting lost in a sea of additional participation. So yeah, I guess my answer to that is difficult to isolate that.
So we have the first question. I think, as I mentioned at the very beginning, I will talk a bit about the state elections in a moment, but seeing as we have a question from the audience, I think it might make sense to bring this in. The question is related to retirement of congressional office holders. And as is mentioned, in 2018, you had an incredibly high number, I think 34 Republicans from the House of Representatives. They sort of saw the writing on the wall and they decided to retire and say, I'm not going to be reelected anyway. And the question would be, this time around, we've once again also seen more Republicans retiring than Democrats. Does this serve as a good indicator of where the election is headed, that we can sort of see a correlation between retirements and the eventual outcome of the election? And perhaps building on that, I don't know if you have data on this, how much easier is it perhaps for the other party to win an open seat rather than running against an incumbent, which would be the case? So do you have any sort of data on this topic?
So in terms of how much of an indicator do retirements serve in an election, the problem you have with that is you have kind of pressure in both directions. So you have some members who retire because they think it's going to be a good year and they think this is a good time to step away because the party will win my seat when it becomes open. So that's brilliant. But then you also have incumbents who retire for precisely the opposite reason. You have incumbents who have traditionally managed to win every year, and they think this is going to be a really difficult year to try and re-win this seat. I'm just going to step away from it. So those are the two kind of tactical retirements that you get. And obviously, looking at it from a data point of view, they're pushing in complete opposite directions. Of course, you get lots of retirements that aren't as tactical. I mean, the reason that's always given is to spend more time with the family, and that's maybe true 1 in 5 times that people say that. But so yeah, it's really hard to unpick those to say to get the real reason why members are retiring and kind of what that means. I would make the argument that in 2018, a lot of those Republican retirements were just through disaffection with on a personal level with Trump, and the idea that they didn't want to keep being in this party kind of thing. In terms of the question about ease of winning, so the difference has got a bit less due to the increased polarization. In the past, being an incumbent was really, really good. I mean, I think there are some election cycles in the early 2000s and late 90s where it's something like 98, maybe even 99% of incumbents just getting re-elected. Those numbers aren't as high now. I mean, don't get me wrong, they're still high. They're still 80, 85%. But because of partisanship, being an incumbent isn't as strong. So what we see now is we see very few, and you pointed to it earlier, this idea of Democrats in red states 2 years ago, and now we've got a few Republicans in bluish states. So for example, Cory Gardner in Colorado. In a pre-polarized time, Cory Gardner might be able to campaign on his experience in Washington and say, I'm not that kind of Republican. I'm reaching across the aisle. I'm doing good work. Whereas nowadays, the only thing that people are looking at when they're voting in Colorado is the fact that he's got an R after his name, and that's probably why he's going to lose.
Exactly. So yeah, as you mentioned, things aren't looking too good for somebody like Cory Gardner, and yeah, you see this fascinating trend. The general trend of congressional elections is this increasing nationalization. I mean, just as a number, I think in 2016 was the very first time that the Senate result and the local Senate result and the local presidential result were the same. So sometimes you see ticket splitting, that in a given state, a Republican presidential candidate will win that state, but a Democratic senator wins at the same time. And in 2016, I think for the very first time, you saw no such splits. So, and you see that at the House level as well, as you mentioned, this nationalization, that your own partisan identity is so much more important than all other factors today. And again, going back to 2018, this kind of explains why Republicans gained those Senate seats, that you had Democrats in deep red territories and their luck essentially had just run out. They were able to win in 2012 and 2006, two very good Democratic election cycles. And 2018 was a good Democratic election cycle as well, but it just wasn't enough to overcome the sort of partisan identity and the partisan irrelevance. Before,
I'm sorry, I was going to add on to that, and it's self-fulfilling, right? Because that then influences tactics. So if we talk, you mentioned Lindsey Graham in South Carolina. And let's compare tactically what he should be doing in this campaign versus what Susan Collins in Maine should be doing. Now, Joe Biden's going to win Maine, Donald Trump is going to win South Carolina. So it makes tactical sense for Lindsey Graham to completely tie his bandwagon to the Trump trailer and say, yeah, if you're voting for Trump, you should also be voting for me. Because at the moment, Trump's ahead of him in the polls by about 8 or 9 points. Whereas for poor Susan Collins, she's got every association with the Republican brand is harmful for her, and so unpicking that is and probably if Susan Collins loses, she'll probably lose because of her support for Brett Kavanaugh, and even her stance on this Supreme Court position and saying she won't fill it before the election is probably not going to be enough to save her.
Exactly. So yeah, as I promised at the very beginning, I'd like to talk just quickly about some of the state races before we can get back and then perhaps spend the final about 20 minutes or 15 minutes discussing some of the topics. Now, some of you in the audience may be wondering what kind of relevance do American state elections have on my everyday life. We have 11 gubernatorial races this year, and if you look at the state level, you have 50 states with 99 state legislatures, and 86 of those are holding elections as well. Now, it's important to understand that, let me just perhaps share my screen already. It's important to understand a couple of things, that first of all, federal elections in a lot of ways are the domain of states as well. So the US Constitution explicitly states that it's the states that determine the time and manner of choosing state representatives, or representatives rather, to the US Congress. And if you look at the last couple of weeks and months, you see some very good examples of why state elections matter even at the federal level, because just think about the whole discussion concerning mail-in voting and early voting, these kinds of things. That's all down to the states and sometimes even counties, which determine whether or not people are able to vote via mail without a valid excuse or things like that. So this really has an impact. And for example, I mean, look at Florida. Florida is a perennial battleground state, and you have a Republican state legislature, you have a Republican governor. And I think you can kind of make the case that maybe Florida won't be exactly a level playing field for both candidates. So, you know, depending on what kind of steps have been taken. So just to provide you with a quick overview of the situation that both parties find themselves in right now at the state level. And in a second, we'll also talk about the relevance concerning redistricting. First of all, the Obama era was an absolute disaster for Democratic state parties. I mean, they were absolutely destroyed at the state level. You can see right here that the Democratic Party lost close to 1,000 state legislators during President Obama's 2 terms. Considering that there are about 7,400 seats across the different state houses and state senates, that's quite a high number. So the Democratic Party found itself in a pretty deep hole at the beginning of the Trump era, and they've been able to, well, dig themselves out of that hole to a certain extent. One good indicator is to look at these so-called state trifectas. Now, at the state level, you essentially see a replication of the system that you have at the federal level. You have a bicameral legislature, and you have an executive office, a governor that's elected separately. And currently, you have 36 so-called state trifectas, where one party controls both chambers of the state legislature and the governor. And as you can see, since 2016, since the end of 2016, actually, so the data looks at the elections, or it incorporates the 2016 election cycle, Democrats have been able to gain 9 trifectas, so they've really made some inroads, whereas Republicans have lost 4. So at the beginning of the Trump era, the situation looked quite good for Republicans. You had a lead of 19 state trifectas, and that lead has been slashed to 6. And I think you could venture a guess that if we talk about state elections, once again, perhaps at the end of our Web Talk series, you might see a draw or a tie between both parties. But as I mentioned, state elections matter obviously from a local perspective. The United States is a heavily federalized country, so issues like healthcare, that's something that is still to a significant extent determined at the state level. Things like reproductive rights, access to abortion, that's in a lot of ways determined at the state level. Other things like gun rights and so forth, those are state matters. But there's one other very important point, and this is where, you know, I'm not going to make a pop quiz or anything, but I mentioned redistricting at the very beginning of today's talk. As I mentioned, every 10 years, the 435 seats to the US House are reallocated on the basis of a census. So you have some states like Florida or Texas that have gained a lot of seats in recent decades because they've seen a lot of population growth. And you have some states like New York State, for example, or Michigan that have actually lost seats. So they've had to obviously redraw their district boundaries as well. And even if you, for example, keep 5 seats, the Supreme Court says that those congressional districts, once again, we're talking about the US House, the lower chamber of the US Congress, even if you keep the same number of seats, those districts have to have population parity. And within a 10-year period, you usually have some population movement. So even in states that keep their number of seats, district boundaries need to be redrawn. Now, why is this important from a state perspective? Well, because in most states, it's the state legislature that gets to redraw these congressional districts. So you have the fascinating and perhaps somewhat problematic situation that politicians are able to determine who votes for, well, other politicians. So as you can see right here, you have 7 US states that only have a single congressional district, so they don't have to worry about any of this. But the vast majority, 35 state legislatures, get to redraw these districts. In all of these states, except for Connecticut and North Carolina, the governor does have a veto. So this is why these trifectas are so important as well. If you can snatch a governor, that might allow you to veto any sort of state lines. But yeah, you do see that, as I mentioned, it's largely the domain of the states, which is a bit of a problem because quite often these states do take advantage of their powers, and they tend to draw congressional districts that favor their own party, that favor congressional candidates from their own party. One fascinating example that I wanted to show you is Pennsylvania. Now, some of you might remember 4 years ago, Donald Trump won Pennsylvania by 0.7 percentage points, so less than a percentage point. Republicans won 52% of the popular vote to the US House, once again to the lower chamber of Congress, but they were able to win 13 of the state's 18 congressional seats. So a huge discrepancy. And these borders had been drawn by the Republican state legislature. And if you look at the left, sometimes you do see those interesting, those classic gerrymandering examples of districts that somehow stretch across half the state and somehow incorporate some outlying area. Now in 2018, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court rather invalidated that map from the early 2010s as a result of a lawsuit. And the state Supreme Court came out and said, we are going to redraw those boundaries ourselves. So that's also an example where the judiciary can come in and make some changes. And surprise, surprise, in the 2018 elections with those new district borders, we saw a much more accurate representation or reflection rather of the popular vote. You saw an even split. Democrats won 9 rather than 5 seats. Republicans also won 9 rather than 13 seats. You still do see a slight Republican overrepresentation. This is something that Mike touched upon as well, the concentration of Democratic voters that makes it somewhat difficult for Democratic map makers to draw districts that favor them, because you just have very bunched up Democratic electorates, whereas Republican voters are evenly spread out across the state, which makes it easier for Republican state legislatures to draw nice districts that provide them with majorities that aren't too big, for example. But yeah, as I mentioned, we have an ongoing census. The data is going to be released relatively soon, which means that a lot of the state legislatures that are up for re-election this time around will be tasked with redrawing state boundaries. And if you go back to 10 years ago, I mean, 10 years ago, you had the Tea Party wave of 2010, which came at the worst imaginable moment for the Democratic Party, because this led to huge Republican gains in state legislatures. I think historically, these might have been the biggest Republican gains at the state level ever, which allowed Republicans to redraw a lot of maps. So Democrats recognize that winning the 2020 House elections is important, winning the Senate is important, winning the presidency is important, but actually doing well at the state level is almost equally important, because a lot of, as I mentioned, state legislatures will be tasked with redrawing district boundaries for the next decade. So this is something where 2020 will be a very good year for the Democrats, but depending on what kind of borders you are drawing, you can sort of protect yourself or protect your own party against certain shifts in 2022 and 2024 and beyond. So this is why the Democrats have decided to also spend a fair bit of money in different states, knowing full well where it makes sense to intervene and hopefully gain some of those state legislatures. So yeah, once again, if you do have any questions also perhaps related to some general political developments, you know, I'm sure both of us have views on the confirmation process of Amy Coney Barrett and what this means, or perhaps tonight's debate, the question if this is going to really shift the polls in any meaningful manner. Perhaps, well, let me just see, one question has. Yeah, so Ms. Colander, who's actually, I think, a student of mine, asked, was there a specific moment that the voting of Republicans became ideologically more motivated than it was before? And what might have drawn or made Republicans become more ideologically minded? So, I mean, do you see is there a certain point at which the Republican Party became the party of ideology, or is this something that is perhaps such a long-term trend that it's been around for decades?
So yes, definitely decades. But so I mean, I would go right back to Nixon's Southern strategy. At that point, you get this alignment of partisan ID and ideology, this kind of deliberate targeting of conservative Democrats in the South. That then obviously kind of morphs through into Reaganism, and by that point you've got a clear ideological platform of conservatism that almost all of the Republican Party is broadly on board with. Then you see this kind of reduction of I guess kind of liberal or Rockefeller Republicans year on year, such that they barely exist in Congress anymore. I guess you could look at kind of some New England governors, Charlie Baker in Massachusetts would be the obvious one, who might not willingly adopt the conservative label, but yeah, it's a really long-term trend that leans towards more conservatism. This kind of question about ideological purity, I guess that starts early in the 21st century. This use of Rhino, Republican in name only, and these groups gathering pace in the 21st century to criticize from within their own party starts in the 21st century, but the broader movement of the whole Republican Party towards the conservative movement, I would say start in the 1970s and go from there.
Yeah, exactly. I think I wholeheartedly agree with you. I think if you wanted to cite a specific starting point, you would probably go with 1964 and Goldwater's candidacy, which led to this realignment that essentially the Democratic Party, which had some conservative elements, those conservative elements in the South, they moved over into the Republican camp. The few remaining moderates from the Republican side ultimately would quite often move over into the Democratic camp. There's sort of these shifts, and this has led to an environment in which both parties are clearly distinguishable. I mean, as you showed so well in your graphs, the relevance of ideology is now more important on the Democratic side as well, because the party, I presume, is more ideologically cohesive than it was a few years or decades ago. And just one additional piece of data, for example, Gallup has some interesting data always on the ideological self-identification of people in the different parties. And if you look at the Republican Party, it's pretty much been 65 to 70% conservative for a couple of decades now. But in the Democratic Party, in 2000, for example, only about 25%, I think, of all Democrats describe themselves as liberal, and that share has now gone up to 50%. So the Democratic Party is slowly but surely sort of moving or reflecting some of the trends that you saw on the Republican side as well. Another question that we have, which is related to the upcoming election. So if Democrats win a majority in House elections, do you think that Nancy Pelosi will once again become Speaker? This is, of course, also related to the question, what if Trump does contest the election? Because if there is no president that's elected until January 20th of next year, then Trump will definitely have to leave office. And then I presume Nancy Pelosi is in line, not the first in line, but one of the first in line to become Speaker. Not Speaker, but President, rather. So, I mean, is Nancy Pelosi facing a challenge due to the fact that the Democratic Party has become more ideologically driven? I mean, is that something that could hurt Nancy Pelosi? Do you think that there is an upsurge in people who say, it's time for somebody who is a genuine or more liberal than Nancy Pelosi, perhaps less of an establishment figure, to take over?
So, I mean, there was a debate around it last time. So the debate came from the center. Actually, it was Tim Ryan who got 53, I think, votes from the representatives. So this debate took place 4 years ago. There were some progressives who had a conversation about it, and people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. 2 years ago, not 4 years ago, about whether she was the right person to lead them forward. I would note that while obviously in some ways she's very much the embodiment of the establishment, and she's certainly not, a democratic socialist or anything like that. If you look at Pelosi's voting record, she is one of the more liberal members of the Democratic Party. She represents a very, very safe Democratic district in San Francisco. So in some ways, she's better placed to fend off these challenges from the left than others. Certainly, I think if you had a very more clearly centrist figure, then you might be facing greater calls for this. I do also think, coming back to the kind of competence point, she's shown herself to be very effective in the role, and so I think that probably, if Joe Biden wins the election, I would be very surprised if Nancy Pelosi was not the Speaker of the House. I think only some kind of external trauma would cause the House Democrats to reassess.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question at what point the Democrats will be pushing for a generational change. I mean, to a certain extent, you might argue 2020 would be the perfect moment, control over all three branches of government. Now is the time to, if Democrats do win the House and the Senate and the presidency. But at the same time, you can also make the case that you just mentioned, you need competent people at the top of the party, because, I mean, if you go back, you had unified government in 2016. The Republicans squandered that after 2 years. You had unified government in 2008, or rather starting in 2009 with Barack Obama, and that came to an end just 2 years later as well. And so it probably makes sense to have experienced people at the top who have an agenda and they can follow that agenda and so forth. I mean, that's probably something that Donald Trump lacked in a lot of ways, that he failed to have that clearly sort of delineated path where he said, this is what I want to achieve over the first 100 days and so forth. And in the end, if you look at the midterms, he was only able to point to his tax cuts as the only sort of legislative achievement. And yeah, I guess that had something to do. And of course, on the Republican side, I mean, you do see you mentioned the retirements as well. A lot of very sort of talented Republicans, Paul Ryan, have retired, have left. People who could have perhaps become the face of the party at some point in the future, and they're being replaced by people like Marjorie Greene Taylor and sort of QAnon candidates. So that's a question. I mean, the Republican Party, as you also showed, they tend to dislike experienced candidates. I mean, I don't know. This is, of course, something that I don't know if you figured that out, but do you understand the reasons behind that? I mean, what are perhaps some of the Republican arguments against experience? What's the reason there?
So I mean, I guess this feeds into the wider conservative narrative of government as the problem. And so, yeah, you frequently see in these primary campaign literatures, what you see is, I'm not a politician. I've worked in the real world, and if they do campaign on experience, they tend to either campaign on experience in business or quite often experience in the military. And actually, the military is true, just as true for the Democrats. They also have kind of strong group ways of getting them in. So I think this is where it stems from, and is more visible on the Republican side because of that narrative of government is the problem. Send me to Washington. I know the real world, and I'm not a politician, and I can make it all better. Just on the point of competence and what the Democrats, if they get unified government now, and I think you pointed to it well in your the slides you had on the Senate, those Senate seats in 2 years' time are going to be really difficult to defend. So they might be in a situation where we've really only got 2 years to legislate to get things done, and they're probably going to be doing it with a Supreme Court that's very conservative now. And so, yeah, I think there's going to be a coordinated attempt between the House, the Senate, and the presidency in that scenario to really get as much of their legislative agenda passed in the next 2 years as they possibly can. And I think a lot of their struggle is going to come up against the court. Yeah,
it's of course fascinating. You feel like every presidential candidate usually runs on a platform of DC is broken, we need to change something. I mean, I just remember John McCain, who had by that point, I think, been in the Senate for a couple of decades as well in 2008, running on this platform of, we need to reform Washington, DC, our government is broken and so forth. And you were wondering, well, what have you been doing the last couple of decades? Yeah, it's a particularly on the Republican side, you have this anti-government, this sort of populist sentiment of the best government is the kind of government that is made by people that are sort of regular people. Of course, that's something that Trump ran on as well. This argument: I'm not a politician. I have my own business, and as we've now found out, his business acumen probably isn't all that great either. But the question there, of course, is, or not the question, but it's sort of a populist Republican approach that, where you could probably say the sort of populist anti-elitism has spread throughout the Republican Party. You mentioned the Southern strategy. That's sort of part of it. If you look at the South, historically, the South, for obvious reasons, has never been a big fan of the federal government. For if you look at slavery, the Civil War, and then federal intervention in the 1960s, so this sort of attitude is widespread. One of the questions, perhaps that's sort of a general question, because we can branch out into, as I mentioned, into all kinds of political questions. Who will come after Trump if he will lose the election? Is there a chance that one of his children will try to run in 2024? Well, the Republican Party is crazy about inexperienced candidates. So do you think that there's a chance of perhaps Don Jr. running in 4 years' time? Or
so I think that I wouldn't want to make a prediction for who's going to be the candidate in 4 years' time. But what I will say is that this Trumpian element of the party is out of the bag now. And knowing what we know about the character of Donald Trump, it seems unlikely to me that he's going to leave the stage quietly if he loses this election. Now, whether in whatever form that takes, but if we work from the basis of if we're talking about candidate for 2024, we work from the basis that Joe Biden is inaugurated in January. I do not see Trump leaving the political arena, and whether that would mean he might consider another run in 2024, or there be some clearly Trumpian candidate in the race. There is going to be some sort of manifestation of that element of the party in the 2024 race. And the challenge to the more establishment business conservatives within the party is, can they coordinate around a candidate better than they did in 2016? I would make the argument that 2016 was as a failure of the Republican Party as it was about any institutional processes. The organized parts of the Republican Party failed to choose a viable candidate, of which they had several, and back them with the resources and endorsements that they needed, and they didn't take Trump seriously enough. I don't think they'll make that second mistake a second time, but I do think that they are susceptible to making the first. So there will be some Trumpian element, and the Trump influence will pertain in 2024, whoever that faction supports.
Yeah, and of course, I mean, as you mentioned, Donald Trump could potentially run once again if he loses this election. I mean, he'll be significantly older. I mean, personally, yeah, his children are always mentioned. Do they have political aspirations? Of course, one thing that the Republican Party might have going for it, as you alluded to, they've now experienced Trump once in the primaries, so I think they kind of, they know what's coming, and they can perhaps coalesce around an establishment candidate early on than what they did 4 years ago. I mean, that's one of, as you mentioned, one of the big mistakes that the Republican Party made is that they never really decided. You showed the cover of the book, The Party Decides. The problem was the party didn't decide 4 years ago. If they had perhaps supported somebody like Marco Rubio in early January, who knows what might have happened. The problem there was that you had so many establishment candidates who all thought, as soon as I'm the last guy standing facing Trump, I'll win this election. So, I'll stay in the race even if I don't have any chances. And then ultimately the Republican Party wound up with a sort of two-person race between Trump and Cruz, which didn't really make the establishment particularly happy either, because Cruz didn't really represent an alternative. I mean, perhaps building on that, we've spoken so much about the primaries as well, or a lot about the primaries. Is there any way that political parties can regain a semblance of control over these primaries, or is this just a battle between different intra-party factions? Do the parties, these sort of established parties, have any tools at their disposal where they can exert a bit more influence and sort of push the electorate in a certain direction?
So yeah, absolutely. And I mean, talking about the presidential primaries, I think what happened in the Democratic race this time is a perfect illustration of the party decides. You know, I think you might have been, if everyone had stayed in that race, you might have ended up in a similar scenario that the Republicans had in 2016 with Bernie. And now Bernie is not Democratic elites or the members of the DNC. He is not their idea of a viable candidate. But what happened? Well, as soon as Joe Biden emerged after South Carolina, you had this very coordinated attempt, a coordinated attempt that I would make the argument is difficult to pull off by anyone other than Barack Obama. I would be very surprised if there weren't direct phone calls going in from the most senior and the most respected person in that political party. I would suggest that things like offers might have been made. Someone like Pete Buttigieg, I think in a Biden administration, you might well see him emerge as something like a future ambassador to the United Nations or something like that. So political parties have a number of sticks and carrots that they can offer to people. Really what they're looking to do is either they can either use money to tell voters why someone's better or worse, or they can do things like clear the field. And the Democratic Party did that very effectively in 2020, and we saw a wide, messy field get reduced down straight after Super Tuesday to just two viable candidates. So that would be, to me, the main way that political parties can do it. Whether they're always inclined to, whether they see it as putting their thumb on the scale, is another question. But certainly they do still have these tools available to them.
Yeah, I mean, 2016 appeared to show that the party no longer decides, but as we saw in 2020, at least on the Democratic side, the party can still decide if you have the right people. I mean, as you mentioned, Barack Obama, who still holds a lot of sway in the party, as we saw also during the convention. Yeah, I mean, it'll be interesting to see what kind of strategy perhaps Republicans will come up with for 2024 if Donald Trump is ousted from office this time around, because I think there's virtually nobody within the sort of upper echelons of the RNC who at least openly wants to see a similar kind of candidate emerge in 2024. They'd be much happier with some sort of standard, somebody like Mitt Romney, who looks presidential and is relatively moderate, and we'll see if they come up with a plan to sort of stop Trumpian candidates in that track. But as you mentioned, the genie is out of the bottle, and I would argue that that also is a fact, because this kind of Trumpian attitude has been a part of the GOP for a long time, as you showed with your own graph, the decreasing preference for experienced candidates and so forth. So I guess Trump is here to stay in a lot of ways, regardless of what happens on November 3rd. Thanks to the congressional elections, thanks to the congressional makeup of the Republican Party, the Trumpian attitude will be here or will remain with us. So thank you very much to our audience, and thank you very much also to, of course, Mike Cowburn, who really was kind enough to share his latest insights, which I don't know if they've already been published or not, but so we were sort of privy to some of the latest data, and I think the relevance of this data will only increase over the coming years as the Democratic Party has become more ideologically minded, ideologically driven as well. So thank you very much from myself and all of us to you.
Thank you very much for having me.
So, nächste Woche wird es dann auf Deutsch weitergehen und wir werden mit Stefan Bierling von der Universität Regensburg über Donald Trumps Präsidentschaft sprechen. Stefan Bierling hat mit America First Donald Trump im Weißen Haus eigentlich die erste Aufarbeitung der Trump-Präsidentschaft veröffentlicht. Wir werden schauen, was ist denn Donald Trumps Vermächtnis im innen- und außenpolitischen Bereich, egal was am 3. November passieren wird. Denn auch wenn Donald Trump abgewählt werden sollte, wird er eine Hinterlassenschaft im Land lassen, die wahrscheinlich über Jahre oder gar Jahrzehnte das Land begleiten wird, insbesondere wenn er eine dritte Richterstelle auf dem Supreme Court besetzen kann. Dann werden bestimmte konservative Ansichten doch in der Politik weiterhin sehr großen Einfluss haben. Wie gesagt, mit Stefan Bierling werden wir dann darüber sprechen, inwiefern die Präsidentschaftswahl ein Referendum über Trump ist und um was es überhaupt geht bei so einem Volksentscheid über Trump, was Trump vorzeigen kann. Ich würde mich freuen, wenn Sie nächste Woche vielleicht wieder dabei sind. Ich wünsche Ihnen einen schönen Rest der Woche und vielleicht dann auch heute Nacht eine interessante TV-Debatte, auf die wir dann vielleicht nächste Woche auch eingehen werden. Und bleiben Sie gesund.